Hello, everyone. I can see some participants joining progressively, so we'll be able to start in a few seconds. I'm just waiting for people to join. All right, so let's start. Welcome to this webinar that will cover the latest updates on the ongoing industry work intended to facilitate compliance with a certain obligation of the DSA. In particular today, so we will discuss the recent release of IAB Tech Lab's specification for DSA ads transparency. So as probably most of you know already, on the deadline for complying with DSA is fast approaching. It's February 17, 2024. And even though the DSA introduced new transparency obligation for online platforms, it has ramification on other players in the ecosystem, given the nature of the advertising supply chain. So as a result, there has been some intense work and progress over the past months to define and develop a solution that facilitate compliance with these new transparency requirements for standard communication between online platforms and their supply chain partners. So today's webinar is a good opportunity to understand the state of play of this initiative, and also understand how your organization should anticipate the entry into force of the DSA. So if we move to the agenda slide, so I'm happy to welcome some great panelists to provide you with an overview of the work that has been done so far. So we will start with a presentation from Jennifer Derkener-Wood and David Weinberg from PrivacyWise. So they will describe the approach that was developed by the DSA task force at IAB Europe to determine the minimum requirement of this solution for ad transparency. Then we will have a deep dive into the actual technical solution by Rowena Lam, who's a Senior Director of Privacy and Data at IAB Tech Lab. So Rowena will run you through the DSA transparency specification that have been recently released by IAB Tech Lab for public comments. And then we will finish by a presentation from Yonel Naftanaila, who's the Director of Program Development at EDAA. So Yonel will explain how the ad choices icon can be used in the context of their new program to facilitate the rendering of the DSA transparency information, and also how this new program is going to leverage the technical standard from IAB Tech Lab. So thank you first, all of you, for taking the time today. And before I leave the floor to Jennifer and David, I wanted to go over some housekeeping items. So first, the webinar will be recorded, so we will be able to share a link to the video in a follow-up communication. We'll also include all the links to the relevant resources that are going to be discussed today. And second thing, so we will have time at the end for questions. So please use the Q&A box, and we will run through them at the end of the 3 presentations. So Jennifer and David, I hand over to you now for the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Ninon. I'm going to start things off with a little background, and then I'll hand it over to Jennifer to get more into some details. And then, as Ninon said, Rowena will really dive into the technical stuff. Before I do that, I really want to thank everybody who's on this, who's presenting in this town hall today, from all these different organizations, all of the companies who participated. This is really the product of a lot of input and collaboration from a lot of different people from different organizations, and it's been really rewarding to be a part of it. we got involved over a year ago. So in the summer of 2022, when IAB Europe got in touch with us, even before the DSA was finalized and adopted, and Tony and the IAB Europe team understood, because of the problem, and we'll get into that, the problem that the DSA creates for providing the ad transparency that's a requirement in Article 26 of the DSA. Without some standardization and coordination among the industry, it was going to be really, really messy. So IAB Europe team got in touch with us to help develop something. We had no idea what it would be at that point. That was the summer of 2022. We watched. We began our work understanding the sort of the general scope, parameters of the DSA and the articles that we would be concerned with. We watched as the DSA was finalized, and now we had a deadline. Now we had a final version. The task force has been working since then, meeting about weekly, along with some subgroups getting together to drill into specific issues. As you know, and as we're talking about today, we've finalized a spec, what we're calling an MVP, a minimally viable product to facilitate the communication necessary for parties in the ecosystem to comply with ad transparency requirements that have been imposed via the DSA. Oh, sorry, next slide. I forgot that I was supposed to. So this has been the timeline. We started back in the summer of 2022. The date of applicability for VLOPs, very large online platforms, has passed. Our approach has been released recently. We've put it out for comment earlier this year, and then another version more recently. And then we handed it off to Tech Lab to put the finishing technical touches on the specification and to maintain it and shepherd it over time. Ahead of us is the date of applicability for all online platforms coming up in the beginning of next year. Next slide. So the problem is that DSA Article 26 requires online platforms, and we won't get into the details of how those are defined, but it's a subset. We'll call it a subset of publishers that meet the requirements of the DSA. Online platforms are required to make disclosures, certain disclosures about the ads that are shown on their properties. The problem is that the information, or much of the information that needs to be disclosed, is often, maybe most of the time, in the hands of intermediaries. So it requires information about who the advertiser is, who paid for the ad, what parameters were used to target the ad, and so forth. And those are often not bits of information that the platform where the ad is shown holds, but rather an intermediary who purchased the ad space and selected the ad and delivered the ad will hold. Given that problem and the very networked and interdependent and dynamic and organic nature of the ads ecosystem, it was clear that things could get really confusing if we didn't have some standardization around how that information is collected, compiled, pulled together, and delivered to the platform or to somebody so that it could be disclosed at the time and place where it needs to be disclosed. And so our work was to set out to come up with some kind of specification that would facilitate compliance in the market. So it would facilitate the gathering, the communication of this information in the ad supply chain so that it could be delivered and platforms could comply with their disclosure obligations that are imposed under Article 26. And with that, I will hand it over to Jennifer, who's been leading our task force for some time now and has really had her hands, has been a key author of the specification. Thanks,
Thanks, David. Next slide. So this one has, animation. So to dive further into detail about how the task force decided to approach and solve for the need to communicate DSA transparency information, we've understood that there are essentially kind of two factors here, or two pieces of information that can be facilitated. And so delivering DSA transparency ultimately to consumers requires the cooperation of the supply chain vendors and ad tech partners to A, support online platforms' flexibility of rendering, so orchestrating how that information gets shown and what the publisher or platform needs in order to facilitate that. And secondly, B, to actually identify the DSA transparency information. So specifically on behalf of who paid who paid for the ad, and on whose behalf was an ad served, and what user parameters are applied to the ad. Those are the three specific pieces pertaining to DSA transparency information. The first point here, as we kind of work through the product requirements at a detailed level of how this works. An intermediary must know when DSA applies to an impression in order to provide DSA transparency information to that platform. The second, if you can click, an online platform has the option to delegate the rendering of DSA transparency disclosure to intermediary partners. For example, to render in ad. Online platforms should have a mechanism to indicate this need to their intermediary partners. Third, an online platform should receive confirmation that the intermediary partner will render that DSA transparency information. And finally, an online platform can request that DSA transparency information from their intermediary partners, including on whose behalf the ad was served, who paid for the ad, and what types of user targeting parameters were applied, which is the substance of the DSA transparency information requirements. And so this flow of how we want to see orchestration and communication through the supply chain really informs the super detailed level that Rowena will get into. On the next slide, I'll echo some of the sentiments that that David had around collaboration and interaction. And at its core, we've designed something that can be used in a multitude of use cases. And so this diagram here explains, coming from the left-hand side, an intermediary can forward that purple arrow of the DSA transparency information that we've just defined here. And that information then can be sent directly to the platform for the platform to render this information and display it to the end consumer. Or the ad creative and ad creative partners can grab that information, be sent that information, and render in some proprietary manner. Or also we're excited that EDAA is with us, and we can have that information rendered in ad through the ad choices icon. So there's the optionality about how to use this data object and this information. And on the next slide, a note about our timeline and our interaction with our partners here. So today, there's plenty of discussion and conversations that you can be having, both at a product, legal, and operational level. What are your requirements and what are your partners' requirements? And soon, and this is where Rowena will be able to guide us through, as that published technical specification comes, that's when we expect to see deployments starting. So we're so excited to have Rowena on board with us for their public comment period of the tech spec, and I will pass the microphone to Rowena. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Next slide. So I wanted to start with the current DSA user parameter list as part of this MVP. This is a key piece of data that needs to be transmitted, as both Jennifer and David just highlighted. And these are the parameters that are used for selecting the ad that's ultimately displayed to the user. The reason why I'm showing this is to really show that this is an enumerated list to support just the MVP version of this technical specification. But obviously there is flexibility to extend or update the list of parameters as needed in the future. We would just add additional IDs in the future. And so then the question is, how do these enumerated parameters, this is a key piece of data, actually get communicated? And so for the MVP solution, we are relying on the use of an existing standard, OpenRTB, because most are familiar with this, and it makes implementation a little bit easier for the industry. So OpenRTB is the initial mechanism for communicating the necessary DSA information between parties in the ecosystem. And so this, on the right-hand side, you can see a sample of what the bid request looks like. And the idea here is that this is an extension of the regs object within OpenRTB. And there's a couple of different attributes included in the request extension. And the first is a piece of data that's we're calling DSA info. And this attribute, what's included in it is to, and the purpose of it is to indicate whether this bid request is going to be subject to DSA transparency. So going back to what Jennifer highlighted in the first product requirement. The second attribute in the request extension is the pub render. And as the name sort of already indicates, it's used to indicate whether the publisher is going to render the DSA transparency themselves. And this is to satisfy that requirement that the online platform must have the optionality to display the DSA information themselves or to delegate this to an intermediary partner. Third attribute is the data to pub attribute. And this is used to indicate whether the online platform still needs the DSA data, even if they have indicated in that pub render attribute that they're not going to display the information themselves. And the purpose of data to pub is for auditing. So ultimately the requirement and the obligation is on the online platform, and so they may still want to receive that data, even if they're not ultimately going to render that information to the consumer. And then the last attribute in the bid request is the transparency object. And what this contains is the array of domains of the entities that applied targeting and the contributing parameters that ultimately led to the selection of the ad that was displayed to the end user. Next slide. Next slide. And then we move into the bid response. So on the right again is a sample bid response where there is an extension to the bid object. A couple of attributes here too. The first attribute, and what's different than the request, because this is data that only someone who's downstream, the advertisers, would have access to, is the behalf attribute. And so what this is a free text representing on whose behalf this ad was displayed. Next attribute in the extension is the paid attribute, also a free text field. And what this represents is who actually paid for the ad. And this may or may not be the same as the behalf value, but it is required even if it is the same. Next is the transparency attribute, very similar to the transparency object from the bid request. So it is an array of domains of the entities that applied the targeting and the contributing parameters that ultimately led to the selection of the ad that was displayed to the end user. And the last is the ad render attribute. And this allows the buyer or advertiser to indicate whether they will be rendering the DSA transparency information. And that helps satisfy that last requirement that Jennifer walked through. Next slide. And so the last piece of the specification is the URL-based transport of the DSA transparency information. And as you can see here, the data points mirror the data that we just saw that were passed in the bid request and response, with the only difference being that there isn't communication of the exact entity that contributed which parameter for the selection of the ad. And so there's the question of, well, what about the actual display of the information to the consumer? This text spec doesn't define the mechanism. Jennifer and David sort of mentioned this already. It doesn't define the mechanism for how this must ultimately be displayed to the consumer. again, online platforms may want to undertake that themselves, while others may want to delegate that responsibility. And so the MVP of this specification is really focused on the transmission of the data and the facilitation of the communication between parties on who will ultimately display that required information to the consumer. And from there, the entity, the online platform may decide how it will be displayed. And one of the mechanisms, which I know Ianel's going to get into a little bit more, is the EDAA's Ad Choices icon. So with that, I think it's a good point to pass off to Ianel.
Yeah, thanks, Rowena. Yeah, so I'm Ianel. I'm the EDAA's Director of Program Development. And just to open with a very short about EDAA slide. So founded in 2012, getting into the second decade of its existence. The core mission of EDAA is to provide towards European consumers transparency, choice and control, and consumer education, which seems very fit in the context of discussing about DSA and transparency as per the Article 26. So who are our members? The most important advertising industry associations in Brussels, IAB Europe included. It includes advertisers, agencies, advertising intermediaries, direct marketers, publishers, and digital media. And the participating companies who are not members, they are participating companies in the program, many of whom are represented in this webinar, would be members of the above organizations. We provide to the market three main tools: the Ad Choices icon, which is the main topic of our my sort of presentation today, yourlinechoices.eu, and the EDAA Trust Seal. Our challenge, moving on to the next slide, when the DSA started to be discussed in Brussels, was a little bit the complement of what David described in the beginning of this webinar, which is by looking at the early draft of Article 26, it had a different number at the time, but the main sort of key characteristics were still there. So things related to each specific advertisement, each individual recipient, clear, concise, unambiguous manner, in real time, the fact that an ad is an ad, all those things. The part in blue at the bottom of the slide speaking about information directly accessible from the advertisement, all those things were there since almost day one of the DSA draft. So for us, knowing that Ad Choices is such of a prominent symbol, and it could be used to sort of be the entry point towards the transparency information and to facilitate compliance with Article 26 of the DSA. The challenge was, on the one hand, to fine-tune the assets of the program. So the Ad Choices icon, the consumer choice platform at yourlinechoices.eu, and the seal, so that to respond to this new challenge. So that's on the one hand, and on the other hand, to identify a workable technical mechanism through which this communication of information will flow back and forth. And this is where it feels that everything finally comes together, because now the mechanism exists, the entry point exists, and it existed for a while. So I think, and this is our common hope at this point, that the industry has what the industry needs in order to at least make the first steps towards accommodating the requirements of the DSA and Article 26 of the DSA. So with that, just moving on to the next slide, what would be the role of the EDAA tools in this context, right? So the Ad Choices icon would become the preferred entry point for our level DSA transparency disclosures. so in ad, but it also could be used as an entry point on properties, in a footer of a website or something like that, depending on what the platform chooses. YourLineChoices.eu could be used as one of the available options for choice, but obviously, again, that's the preference, as Rowena and Jen have explained. That's 100% the preference of the platforms themselves. And then the EDA certification would also include DSA-related checks going forward. There's a fourth dimension, which is related to the enforcement of the EDA program. And those companies who are here, and maybe some of them are certified under the EDAA. So we're doing this, the certification, we're doing it in collaboration with EDA's approved certification providers. So that would include DSA-related checks. And then the enforcement is being done together with EASA. And there seems to be like a little formatting issue on the slide. So the last row is hidden, but I'm going to read it aloud. So the enforcement side would be aimed towards consumers, so to address consumer queries, and also to bring non-participating players into the program. I think this is really, really important, because platforms will only be able to accommodate Article 26 by collaboration of their upstream partners. So this becomes really, really important that everyone or most players in the ecosystem would join the mechanism. And of course, at the basis, and this is why this is put at the bottom of the slide, because the foundation is really the AS Transparency Solution Specification, as explained by Rowena and by Jen and by David, to allow the transfer of information between the parties that are part of the transaction. So moving on to the next slide. From our point of view, the status and the next steps. So from the EDA side, as I mentioned earlier, we started to think about all this at some point back in 2021, when DSA was still in very, very early stages. And then, of course, we discussed about it. We even came up earlier this year with a few draft documents related to how to use the icon, so the Add Choices icon, to accommodate Article 26, wrapped with a policy guidance to further explain those technical specs, and with some high-level policy principles. Those technical specs are not to be seen in the same way as the Tech Lab specification. The EDA specs are really a guideline on how to use the Add Choices icon, how to display it, where it should be rendered, and so on, right? So that's in draft. A first version of the draft was published a couple of months ago, before there was clarity on how exactly the technical mechanism is going to look like. And our immediate next step, so before the end of the year, actually, we're planning to send a revised version of those draft documents towards the EDA steering group this week. And then a revised version will be sent to the EDA steering group with a 30 days consultation period. And then in January 2024, we plan to release the EDA guidance to the market, so that people will know how to use the Add Choices icon and how to integrate it with the IAB Europe / Tech Lab mechanism in order to render the DSA information. So moving on to the next slide. In a nutshell, in my sort of concluding messages would be fairly simple. The IAB Europe / Tech Lab protocol would be the mechanism of choice for information transport. The Add Choices icon would be the sort of the prominent marking, which is referred in Article 26 of the DSA for information disclosure. YourLine Choices can be used by platforms and their partners as some kind of a backup option when it comes to information disclosure. Consumer choice. And we as EDA are releasing guidance around how to use the icon and the consumer-facing aspects of the program. And last but not least, I think it's very important to stress that platforms, like it or not, will need to be compliant in February 2024. And when discussing with some of the platforms, we're hearing like a very loud message, which is come February, they will need to make sure that the ads which are being delivered on their properties, provide or at least work with the mechanism, maybe with the ad traces icon, depending on their preference, to provide this transparency information as per DSA Article 26. So anyone who needs to support the business of online platforms should really get on board to engage with Tech Lab and understand the technical transfer protocol, build against it already, and engage with EDAA regarding the ad traces icon and program participation, and understand how the two work together in a better way, because in February, this needs to be happening. By the way, when I say anyone who acts as the final link, that would probably include the platforms themselves in the case of direct sales and sort of inventory, which is, again, sold directly. So that would be like kind of my ending message, like a call to arms to let's get going, because it's very late in the process. And with that, I'm just going to pass back to Ninon for a Q&A session.
Yeah, thank you, Lionel, and thank you everyone for the presentations. Before we take questions from the audience, and I actually already see a couple, we wanted to address some of the most frequently asked questions. So first, what are the subsequent steps post the release of the technical specification? So maybe Rowena, I will direct this question to you, and also Jennifer when it comes to the implementation guidelines.
Yeah, thanks, Ninon. Ian sort of in his last slide alluded to, and Jennifer as well, to what the next steps are, which are that folks need to be, as soon as the specs are finalized, they are in public comment through the 14th, so just a few more days. But once the specs are actually finalized, everyone does need to start planning and building to the specifications to support it. And that is inclusive of intermediaries supporting online platforms, as well as online platforms themselves, in particular, if they plan to, again, as Eno said, like be the final link. Jennifer or David, if you guys have anything to add.
In terms of implementation guidelines, IAB Europe will be publishing some, and we will either publish those the same day or very shortly after the final specifications are out, and they're intended to be a complement and help folks evaluate how to implement, but the specs can stand alone as well.
And I would just to chime in that I would emphasize that there's work you can start doing today. Even without the specification finalized, without the implementation guidelines, there's a lot of operational and policy and legal platforms need to decide if they're going to host the disclosures or delegate it. Platforms need to figure out that they're platforms. Intermediaries need to think about what information they have, how they're going to translate it into the format needed for inserting into the specification. There are, I think, plenty of legal questions about who falls under what provisions. So plenty of work to do right now.
Thank you, David. And another question as well in relation to the approach. So is the solution approach finalized or subject to further modifications? Again, directing this question to Rowena, keeping in mind that, as you mentioned, it's a MVP, but might be modified further down the line.
Yeah, that's exactly it. This is, we keep saying an MVP because that's really what this is. This is an MVP. With any specification, there may be updates as we learn more, right? parameters, for example, as I mentioned, this is an MVP. We're starting with these parameters as we understand what is required. But as that changes, or as we get clarification from the law, right, like there may be updates to the specifications. But we do believe what's being put out there today does help the industry, and in particular the online platforms, comply with the requirements. So nothing's ever, I would say, like no technical spec once it's put out there is ever just done forever. So like potentially further modifications in the future, though not like the immediate future, we don't anticipate.
Thank you. And then a more practical question, although as you mentioned, it's only until the end of the week that the public comment period is open, but who can submit comments and what is the process for submitting technical specification feedback?
Yeah, anyone in the industry can submit comments, and we welcome commentary during the public comment period that ends on Thursday. To submit, you can send your feedback to support@techlab.com. So just send an email to support@techlab.com with your feedback.
Thank you. And now we can move to the questions from the audience. I can see that someone has a hand raised. I'm not sure that we can actually enable like the audience to speak up. So it might be easier if you put your question into the Q&A box, Kinga, if possible. We have already a question from Lucio, who also thanks the IAB and everybody in the industry who have been collaborating on this topic. So Lucio's question particularly relate to the front piece. So if each online platform is going to develop their own rendering solution, we would end up with so many different ways of rendering the required pieces, while probably the DSPs are the best position across the supply chain. So it's really a question about the rendering piece. Maybe David, you could take this question as to why the approach was to really keep as much flexibility as possible for the time being.
Yeah, we made, I think, a decision early on not to be too prescriptive, to build, as we've been talking about it, a minimally viable product to meet, you know, these key requirements that we've identified, and leave a lot of flexibility for the implementation to evolve or organically, for the specification to be used in a lot of different circumstances. I think there are potentially so many different circumstances where this might be used. So we have classic programmatic advertising, but there are a lot of other cases, and there are platforms who may have different intentions or different preferences about the way things are disclosed. That the platform might want to control that disclosure to its users, and so they might want to build it. They might want to work with their CMP to develop the disclosures, the front end of disclosures. CMPs might want to add that as an offering, or, you know, as we've considered, the platform can delegate to the intermediary who can make the disclosure from within the ad creative, including behind the icon. And you know, the EDAA, as Anel's talked about, and I think he'll want to jump in. The EDAA, it's more in their wheelhouse to control. This is what the EDAA has been doing, to control how things are disclosed, what things look like behind the icon. So clearly they have an interest in doing that. But the goal is to leave things flexible, let things develop organically. And I think over time, with once we start implementing, we'll see where the issues are, and we'll keep building on top of this. And so this is a start. We made a design decision to be minimal, not too prescriptive, let things develop organically, and we will come back over time and identify where the issues are, and we can layer more on top of this, both in terms of technical and policy additions. I think wants to jump in on that too.
Yonel, maybe you want to add about the principle as well as part of the EDA program when it comes to the rendering.
Just quickly, actually, and just to concur to David's point, so what we've seen in the past with the EDA, right? I think we've seen like 3 categories of rendering of the icon in terms of who's doing it. There would be big players who chose to do it themselves because they have the technical capacity, the resources necessary, and so on, right? So in that's one category. The other category is smaller players who would work with specialized providers. In EDA has 2 specialized providers. Hopefully there will be more, right? CMPs could become specialized providers of this kind of services, rendering, and that kind of stuff, right? So that's always a possibility. I think those would be like the 2. Obviously you can delegate it in this scenario, you can delegate it to DSPs and whatnot, right? But I think some people will always do it themselves. Some people there will be a market for specialized providers, and there will be like a kind of a hybrid model where DSPs and the like basically are going to do it on behalf of platforms, right? And I think it's very wise that the mechanism has been developed with this kind of flexibility in mind. And certainly from our point of view, like with the icon and the whole thing, that's definitely not a problem. So I think we can, I think there's a there, right? But we'll see more when people start implementing.
Thank you. Another question from Alexandre, which I think is for you, Rowena. Mentioned the technical spec. Every field indicates, usually in a technical spec, every field indicates if it's required, recommended, or optional. In this case, nothing is mentioned. So does it mean that every field is required, recommended, or optional?
Yeah, that's a good question and a good call out. The first thing I'll say is that this is an extension. So anyone who's looking and needs the support to comply with DSA transparency requirements would be utilizing the extension. If you are implementing the extension, all the fields that we just took a look at are required. So that's a good question and good feedback, perfect type of feedback to actually receive during a public comment period. So again, encourage folks to definitely send an email to support at IAB Tech Lab with this type of feedback so that we can add this level of detail to the final extension specification.
Thank you. And then we have a question from Vicente. So if a platform is not integrated with the TCF, how could that platform integrate with this specification, taking into account the fact that the user parameter basically are related to the TCF purposes? I'm going to hand over to David or Jennifer, I think, on that one.
I'll take that. Great question. Thank you for asking it. It's a level of detail I think we chose not to get into, but I appreciate you asking the question. The relationship between this DSA specification and the TCF it's kind of a loose coupling. It's not really an integration, and because the requirement of the DSA, at least the part of the DSA that we're concerned with, is just to tell users how they can change the parameters that are used to select the ad. If I think the language is if applicable or as applicable. So if there's a choice, you have to tell the users. And I think the TCF is widely deployed. It's probably the main, not the only, but the main choice that's available. It also provided a convenient paradigm for us to define what the parameters are. There's not a lot in the DSA about what, the DSA says you must disclose the parameters that are used to select the ad, but there's not much detail about what parameters are. And so it seemed convenient and maybe helpful to align the parameters in our DSA specification with TCF purposes. So that helps with definition. It just helps with everybody's understanding of how things work in the industry. It also helps with, pointing to the TCF as the the way that users can change the parameters, but it's not the only way. And if a platform does not implement the TCF, if the platform wants to does the TCF plus something else, that's up to the platform as they make the disclosure. So the platform could point to the TCF if that's what they're doing, or the platform can point to something else. Or they can point to the TCF plus some additional choices that they offer. Again, flexibility was the key here for all the different circumstances and preferences that might be out there among the companies that are implementing parts of this. Clearly, if you're implementing the DSA disclosures behind the Add Choices icon, you'll be pointing to your online choices, as is typical and I think required in usage of the icon today. Though I'll note that we also I think there is a proposal on the table, not yet in the specification, but a proposal on the table to provide information in the DSA data object to the party making the disclosure behind the icon, information for how they could link the user back to the platform's choice mechanism, whether that's TCF or something else. So right now, if you see an ad and you click on the icon and you see a disclosure in relation to the icon, and you're pointed to the maybe privacy disclosures and choices that are made available by those DSPs or intermediaries who are making that disclosure in the icon, but there's no path back to the platform publisher. And so we're going to add that. So we're going to get this like nice closed loop. It'll be a better user experience. But again, it's all about the flexibility. There are lots of different ways to do this. If you're not using the TCF, that's not a problem. You just implement what it is that you are doing.
Thank you, David. And another question. So do EDA and DSA only apply to visual ads? So only to, DSA transparency, only to visual ads. I'm trying to understand the question. So is there any guidance for non-visual ads where no Add Choices icon and user transparency information can be provided, like audio advertisement? I think we've been discussing a little bit before, like other type of format. So I will give that to you, David.
Jen, I think Jen.
Yeah, so I'm not a lawyer and I can't recommend if DSA does or does not apply to, but it does apply to ads, which can be non-visual. When we were in the task force deciding about how to communicate this information, we chose like RTB and the supply chain pathways because it was not particular to, like, for example, web only ads. It could be used in app or for video ads. And so we fully anticipate that this information could also be sent in VAS protocol, for example, for video or audio ads. But when it comes to the rendering piece, as the same for the desktop ads, it's up to the platforms. And so I would say we've left a lot of room to add further detail, but fundamentally, like, DSA applicability is your interpretation, but the spec that we have here can be used across a multitude of different channels. But I can let I'll speak to the EDA part of that.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, the VAS thing is easier. There's some guidance of the EDA, like in the old paradigm of the icon for video, at least. We don't have anything for things like audio for now, and that's a challenge, to be honest, which we will sort of have to wrap our heads around. But for now, I don't have like a clear answer to it. Clearly the technical mechanism can be applied, but how to actually render it, that's a different discussion, right? And mind you, the DSA doesn't say displayed, it says presented. So that's why it says presented, I guess, right? Without being a lawyer as well. So yeah, I don't have like a clear answer to that one, to be honest.
As a final note on that question, if you are in like the video or audio space and you'd like to see further industry standardization around communication of this information, myself or Reina would probably be happy to field your questions.
I would add one thing to that, which is because this information that needs to be disclosed can be delivered to you if you are the platform publisher of whatever audio content or whatever it is, non-display, you can receive that information, you can display it somewhere. So if you have an enclosing web page, an app, an audio or video player or something, I think there's the opportunity technically for you to receive and gather that information and put it in a disclosure somewhere. So it will, again, flexibility. It will work differently from display ads, but there's the opportunity to do something there depending on your particular circumstances.
Thank you, David. Another follow-up question from Vicente. Are we expecting a wider implementation of the specification by publishers that are not categorized or are not considering themselves as a platform? So I'd like to start with Rowena, maybe to flag that specifications support this kind of voluntary approach to DSA transparency, and maybe then hand over to David, Jennifer, and finally Lionel as well for the EDAA program.
Yeah. So I'll start by saying that this was a topic of lots of discussion, and I think it's a little unclear, I would say, what we think the market is going to do, especially those who may not consider themselves platforms. But what the technical specification does support, flexibility, I feel, is like the theme for the conversation today. The technical specification does offer the flexibility for those to like who may or may not sure, whatever the case is, consider themselves a platform, to also request that this information be passed back through. So if we go back to the bid request information, that first field provides the flexibility for folks to simply indicate if they would like this DSA information without having to explicitly state that they are an online platform themselves.
Yeah, thank you. And David and Jen, did you have anything to add before I hand over to Lionel?
Just that this was another driver, again, flexibility. Another driver of taking this very flexible approach is that there is, we're very early days of the implementation of the DSA. There's a lot of legal ambiguity around exactly who might be within scope, and what the specific precise requirements might be on them. And so rather than, we might have taken an approach that was very prescriptive and said, told everybody exactly what to do. But I think that we would have been getting ahead of ourselves, getting over our skis there a bit. There's a lot of room now for publishers to, make a determination or not. Maybe they're a little fuzzy on whether they are a platform or not, or how they want to approach that question. And so there's a lot of flexibility for people to take their own legal approaches here, rather than imposing a policy on them when the implementation of the law is still a little fuzzy.
Yeah, go ahead, Lionel.
Yeah, just a couple of things. So firstly, as David was just saying, I think it's up for the digital properties, right, to determine whether they are a platform or not. Just in relation to the question itself, so assume someone is not a platform, right, and they have a clear determination, but they would want to sort of provide this level of disclosure for whatever reasons. From the EDA point of view, the sort of the path is open, right? We would even encourage it as long as people want to do it. And my view is that in time, not now, there's probably going to be some consumer expectation around it. But I don't know when, I don't know if, right? I don't know if that's ever going to sort of blow up to some kind of regulatory expectation. I don't know that. Nobody knows all that, right? But definitely from our point of view, if people want to do it, they're welcomed. And the only caveat being, if we're doing it, we all have to do it in the same way, right? So we need some level of consistency here. That's the reason for which the technical mechanism exists. That's the reason for which the ICANN exists, and so on, right? Just to do things as much as possible in the same way. But yeah, I think there's no expectation necessarily, But if people are open to it, we would be open to it as well.
Thank you. And we have one last question from Kinga, who I think had their hand raised before. Lots of questions, one of them about the B2B side, about aggregating data for potential business intelligence services for ad monitoring and auditing. Will this be possible? And asking differently, who can get the displayed ad data? Is it only for the end user or B2B players as well? How about the roles of agencies on behalf of brands and brands themselves? If the output data is for end user only, what if end user complain about the level of personalization, profiling, etc.? Will it be an issue for the platform or the intermediary and brand? So I think it's there is, I guess, several questions here. The first one in relation to the who can access actually the data that is being transported, and the second one is like who is responsible for well complying with the user choices. So maybe on the first question I can hand over to Jennifer or David.
I think I mean, look, it's not the intent that this is used or that data is used for other purposes. BI, business analytics, something like that. People may do it. You know, we may see companies, participants, or implementers taking various approaches, technical and/or contractual, to controlling the use of that information. I think that would be normal and happens today in the ecosystem around information that's already available. In terms of, sorry, I'm looking at the question. I'm not sure what the question is about the roles of agencies on behalf of brands. Consumer complaints or concerns around personalization profiling. I mean, we know, you know, consumers may have them. This is an incremental addition to the level of transparency that consumers already have from the TCF or other and ad choices and other transparency mechanisms that we already have in place. There's a lot of information out there for users, for consumers, about data that's being collected about them and how it's being used to target ads. And this is an incremental addition. I don't think it's a very big change. So clearly, if users have concerns, they will have a little bit more information. They'll have the choices that they have available today and the recourse that they have today to either get more information about those practices via their rights under the GDPR or other laws, or via complaints to civil society organizations or regulators. You know.
Thank you. And Lionel, you wanted maybe to add something about complaints and things?
Yeah, just quickly about the complaints part, right? Because so what we're doing right now, as David was mentioning, this is basically an extension of the existing pathways. So one of them, through our choices and then via your online choices, European consumers can place complaints in their own language with the self-regulatory organizations in their country of origin, right? So under the EDAA umbrella. And that is something that we intend to keep, right? So when it comes to consumer complaints, and it's actually thousands of them, people don't really know about it. We publish, it's not really complaints, it's more like consumer queries that down the line can transform into complaints, but usually the process is fairly good, right? So people would kind of understand what's going on and would just not place a complaint. But there's like a feedback and queries mechanism that's existing, that's in place, and which works. Obviously can be improved, but it's there, right? So that's one pathway. And then obviously they can address questions to the companies directly because they have access to them, right? That's why the transparency is there. So to provide such pathways. And I think we have the mechanisms. I'm not claiming they're perfect, but I'm saying they're there and we have something to build on.
Thank you. And we went through all the questions 1 minute before the hour, so that's perfect. I really want to thank all of you for taking the time to run us through all the work that has been done over the past few months. I hope it was very useful for the audience, and that everyone is going to start building according to the IAB Tech Lab specification. We'll share, as I mentioned, like a link to the recording in a follow-up communication. We'll make sure to include the link to IAB Tech Lab's communication and any other resources that we mentioned today. So yeah, thank you all for joining.